3 years before the massacre at Columbine High School, a group of teenagers would descend on a small Florida city like a virus, bringing with them arson, carjacking, and ultimately would end in the murder of a high school band teacher. Who were these individuals? How did they become one of the most notorious self-styled militias in American history? And what would lead them to homicide? On the first episode of Beyond the Blood, we explore the Lords of Chaos.
Gilchrist County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
Yes, ma'am. I just shot my daughter and shot all my grandkids, and I'll be sitting on my step, and when you get here, I'm going to shoot myself.
You will find a homicide at Suite 43 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
Do you admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another, are we not?
All crimes have a motive. Go beyond the blood and discover the reasoning behind the darkest crimes in history.
Fort Myers, Florida is similar to many sleepy cities along Florida's Gulf Coast. Tourists come to visit the tranquil beaches, the nearby Everglades National Park, or to explore Thomas Edison's winter home. In 1996, Fort Myers was also home to the Lords of Chaos. Composed of local Riverdale High School students Peter McNaughty, Christopher Black, Derek Shields, Christopher Burnett, Thomas Toron, Bradley Young, and Russell Ballard. Perhaps the most notorious and known leader of the group was Kevin Foster. Kevin Foster was born Kevin Bates on June 16, 1977, in Amarillo, Texas. One would like to imagine a dark cloud hung over Amarillo on that day. John Bates, Kevin's father, abandoned the family while Kevin was still an infant. This left Kevin's mother, Ruby, to raise Kevin and his half-sister from a previous marriage. As a result of Kevin's father never returning to the household, Kevin's mother moved frequently to Arizona and Montana. Finally, Kevin and his family would return to Amarillo, where Kevin's mother would marry her fourth husband, John Foster. Kevin would eventually be adopted at the age of 12 by John, and this would result in Kevin taking John's last name. After the marriage, the Foster family would continue to move around, much like nomads, to Cuba and Missouri. Kevin would pay his first visit to Fort Myers when he was only 8, and one might have wished he never appeared in the small city. However, Kevin's family would continue to move, and only 7 months later would settle for some time in Canyon, Texas. In Texas, Kevin began to idolize the bandits and criminals, such as Billy the Kid, Frank and Jesse James. Kevin would eventually come to idolize individuals such as Timothy McVeigh and David Koresh. At long last, the Foster family finally settled down in a familiar city, Fort Myers. With a new town came a new school, and Kevin would come to terrorize his new school of Riverdale High, while in his freshman year, Kevin would come to meet Peter McNaughty, who would become a close friend and Kevin's right-hand man in the soon-to-be-formed Lords of Chaos. Kevin's behavior at Riverdale High School would earn him the nickname Psycho. This was based off his erratic behavior and his birth name of Bates. Kevin's behavior was so unpredictable that a student wrote in Kevin's yearbook, quote, "Please don't kill anyone this summer, because I hear it's pretty bad in prison," end quote. Unlike Kevin, Pete McNaughty by all accounts was bright, had dreams beyond graduation, and he was a talented artist. Unfortunately, Pete was small in stature, weak, and ostracized by his classmates. Pete would pour his emotions into violent art. Chris Black was known to be a computer geek, who was not at all considered in shape. Chris was just as isolated and angry as his friend Pete. Eventually, Kevin would drop out of Riverdale High and come to be worshipped by Chris and Pete as everything they were not. In 1996, Pete and Chris were seniors at Riverdale High School, but as a result of Kevin's influence, they would never get to attend college. Instead, Kevin, Chris, and Pete would be joined by Derek Shields and much lesser-known characters to launch a campaign of terror. Chris would come to describe the time before graduation as an impasse. Florida juvenile criminal records show that only Kevin Foster had an arrest record, which primarily consisted of driving offenses. The other members of the soon-to-be-formed Lords of Chaos had no criminal offenses. Kevin's parents owned a pawn shop, and like many pawn shops, sold dozens of firearms. Kevin had been around guns for his entire life. When Kevin was 13 for Christmas, his mother gave him a 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun. With age, Kevin eventually gained access to more weapons as a result of the pawn shop his family owned. McNaughty would estimate that Kevin owned over 25 firearms. On April 12th, Kevin, Pete, and Chris would pile into Kevin's truck. That night they went for a drive. Perhaps this night was the catalyst to the Lords of Chaos. The trio would smash car windows, broke into a gas station, set a bus on fire. In the back of a themed restaurant, they set ablaze 2 birds. Chris would later refer to April 12th as Devil's Night. After a few days, the trio would meet at Kevin's house. However, like all criminals, they attracted a following as word spread through Riverdale High. No longer 3, the trio was joined by 3 other young men, including Derek Shields. Kevin decided they would be given code names: Slim, Fried, Red, Mob, Dog. Kevin would be known as God. They also decided to form a group at this meeting. The group typed up a manifesto which stated, quote, "On April 12th, the Lords of Chaos began a campaign against the world. Be prepared for destruction of biblical proportions. The Lords of Chaos had begun to take its first breath." Pete would sketch the symbol of the group. Based off an inside joke, the symbol was based on a math question Kevin had missed during a test. Meanwhile, a small local paper, the East Lee Tribune, had run a story on the vandalism. The paper described the perpetrators as less than average in intelligence and pea-brained vandals. The article only enraged the trio. Pete would later say, "I was really hurt by that article." On April 17th, the group penned a letter they planned to mail to the Lee County Clerk of Court's Traffic Violations Bureau, but ultimately did not. The letter warned the following, quote, "Lee County is dealing with a formidable foe, with high-caliber intelligence, balls of titanium alloy, and a wicked destructive streak. Be prepared for destruction of biblical proportions. For this is the coming of a new God, whose fiery hand shall lay waste to the populace. The games have just begun, and terror shall ensue." End quote. Kevin, Chris, and Pete did not like their handiwork being mocked. So the following Friday, April 20th, the group vowed to show the city what they could do. Known locally as Cleveland Avenue, perhaps the busiest road in Fort Myers, sat a historical Coca-Cola plant. The Lords of Chaos broke into a nearby tool store and stole propane gas tanks, opened them in the Coca-Cola plant, and lit a 25-foot fuse. As a sick joke, Kevin used a Pepsi can full of gunpowder to help in the destruction. Kevin originally wanted to destroy the building on April 19th, to emulate the Oklahoma City bombing, which had occurred a year earlier. The group retreated to a set of picnic benches where they could view the result of their work. 13 minutes after setting the explosives, a powerful bomb was heard, causing $100,000 worth of damage, and the destruction of the 12,300 square foot historical building. Local authorities would contact the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms due to a bomb being used to destroy the building. On April 26th, the reign of terror would continue as the Lords of Chaos robbed and carjacked Emery Lewis, who owned the local Alva Diner, believing Emery would be carrying money. Derek had a specific dislike for Emery, ever since Emery called his mother insulting names. Unfortunately, the plot did not work out as planned, as Lewis did not have the money the boys hoped for. Lewis managed to survive the attack uninjured. On April 30th, the group decided they would steal clothes from a Dillard to prepare for an upcoming grad night to be held at Walt Disney World. Kevin had planned to steal one of the characters' costumes in a plot to shoot minorities while at the park. As part of a diversion, Kevin rigged a smoke bomb inside the store. However, the smoke bomb was a dud. The boys then decided to go to Riverdale High School and vandalize the school. Once at the school, the group stole latex gloves, a fire extinguisher, 2 staplers, and a bag of canned peaches. Kevin rigged a Clorox bleach bottle full of gasoline with a lit rag and threw it through an auditorium window. Mark Schwebes, age 32, Riverdale High School's music director, was at the school that night conducting an open house, introducing him to next year's freshmen. Mark grew up in the area and had joined the Marine Corps. Mark came back to the area to pursue his passion of teaching. He loved music and his students. Unfortunately, that night, Mark would stumble across the Lords of Chaos. By a payphone in the empty schoolyard, Mark spotted the Lords of Chaos. Mark knew the students were loitering and acting suspiciously. Mark approached the kids and confiscated the stolen items. Mark told the group he would report this to the school police the next morning. Mark then placed the stolen items in his trunk and drove off. When Mark left, Chris notoriously stated, quote, "This has got to be fixed tonight, because tomorrow's a school day, so he's got to die tonight." End quote. Kevin replied if Chris cannot do it, he would. Derek, Chris, Pete, and Kevin all agreed they would take part in murdering Mark Schwebes. Mark had an unlisted telephone number, but the Lords of Chaos were able to obtain his phone number through a directory service. The group called the given number, and once they confirmed Mark's voice on the answering machine, they eventually obtained his address. The core members of the group, Kevin, Chris, Pete, and Derek, hatched a plan to carry out the execution of Mark to prevent him from reporting the run-in. It was decided Kevin would be the triggerman. Chris would be the getaway driver. Pete would act as a lookout. Derek would knock on Mark's door when they arrived at the house. Because Derek was in Mark's class, when Mark looked through the peephole, he would recognize Derek and be more likely to open the front door. On the way to Mark's house, Kevin sang a twisted version of Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Kevin settled on using the Mossberg shotgun he had received for Christmas to be the weapon of choice that night. At 11:30 p.m., the Lords of Chaos drove to Mark's house. Kevin and Derek walked up to Mark's front door. Kevin hid in a pair of bushes adjacent to the front door, and Derek knocked. When Mark opened the door, Kevin stepped between Mark and Derek. Kevin fired 2 rounds from the shotgun, striking Mark once in the face, which is believed to have killed him instantly, and the second round struck Mark in the buttocks. Kevin shot Mark the second time in the buttocks because Kevin was under the false impression that Mark was a homosexual. Falsely believing it would be impossible to trace the shotgun shells to his weapon due to it being a smooth bore, Kevin left the shotgun shells at the scene. Kevin and Derek made the run to the waiting getaway vehicle. The vehicle had a broken muffler and a stolen license plate. However, the loud muffler would come to be what neighbors recall hearing after the 2 shots. At 11:35, deputies with the Lee County Sheriff's Office responded to Mark's residence to investigate. Deputies discovered the scene of horror. Mark's body was laying in a pool of blood. The welcome mat was soaked in blood. The neighbors had begun to gather to discuss the grisly sight. Deputies began to analyze the scene. The most haunting question was who. Deputies also tried to figure out why 2 shots had been fired, and why was one in the buttocks. This did not appear to be a robbery gone wrong, as Mark still had money in his pockets. In Mark's vehicle they found the latex gloves, and cans of peaches Mark had confiscated from the Lords of Chaos earlier in the evening. But this was not much of a lead. Deputies could not make sense of these items. Deputies began to investigate an angle that Mark was involved in some sort of love triangle due to the shot in the buttocks. A crime of passion is overkill, or perhaps an unnecessary shot to a private area. When Kevin returned home after the murder, he called his friend Chris Burnett. Burnett was Kevin's equal, and not a follower like Derek or Pete. Chris Burnett was with the group that night when Mark confronted them at Riverdale High School. Kevin simply told Chris, quote, "It was done," end quote. A love triangle gone wrong was the possible motive splashed on the papers the next day. Rumors swirled at Riverdale High School that Mark had been involved with a woman who was soon to break it off with her current boyfriend. Could this have been the possible motive behind Mark's murder? Kevin, at his home, laughed at the news coverage. He knew he was the actual murderer. Kevin seemed to enjoy the witch hunt. Kevin called his friend Chris Burnett and laughed at how far everyone seemed to be off. Kevin called 2 more boys and boasted to them about killing Mark, before telling them that it was a secret and to keep it to themselves. The Lords of Chaos and its associates would soon begin to brag around school about the murder. On May 2nd, Craig Leash, an associate of the Lords of Chaos, bragged to his ex-girlfriend Julie that he had been there during the murder. In fact, Craig told Julie he had been the one to knock on Mark's door that night. On May 3rd, Julie, wrestling with a guilty conscience of what she had heard, informed the Lee County Sheriff's Office what she knew. From Julie, deputies learned not only the Lords of Chaos were behind the murder of Mark Schwebes, but also the group planned to commit an armed robbery at a local Hardee's where Pete and Derek worked. Deputies then questioned Craig Leash, and learned he had not actually been present during the murder. Detectives also learned the group was behind the Coca-Cola building bombing. Craig would give the detectives the name of Kevin, Chris, Pete, and Derek. Craig Leash and another associate of the group, Brad Young, were eventually released from police custody without criminal charges. Kevin, oblivious to the fact that law enforcement was now onto the Lords of Chaos, decided it was time for the group to strike again. Kevin planned to conduct an armed robbery of a local Hardee's restaurant where Pete and Derek worked. The murder of Mark Schwebes was now hours old. Police had been following Pete and Chris the entire evening of the planned Hardee's robbery. Chris would describe being apprehended as, quote, "flashlights in your face, gun to the back of your head, face against the wall. That you know, when reality intrudes, and you know, you can't deny me anymore," end quote. Police would come to find the vehicle in Pete and Chris's possession had been loaded with firearms. Kevin Foster, in a vehicle with Chris Burnett, traveling to the meat site, had been zeroed in by dozens of police for arrest. At 8:45 p.m., the vehicle Kevin and Chris Burnett were driving in had been signaled by local law enforcement to stop. Kevin instructed Chris Burnett to pull over. Inside the trunk of one of the vehicles, police found Foster's shotgun, a ski mask, gloves, and a newspaper article of the murder. Foster's fingerprint was found on the shotgun, the gloves, and the newspaper. Pete and Chris Burnett's fingerprint was found on the news clipping. In Kevin's last minute of freedom, he told Chris Burnett, quote, "See you in hell," end quote. Deputies would recover approximately 20 guns in the possession of the Lords of Chaos. Brad Young, a new member of the Lords of Chaos, would be brought in, but released. Soon, members of the Lords of Chaos, facing decades behind bars, turned on each other under police pressure. Chris Burnett turned on Kevin. He told everything he knew to deputies. Burnett stated that Kevin told him how cool it was to shoot Mark Schwebes, that the side of Mark's face just blew off. Burnett confirmed to investigators that Derek, Pete, and Chris were with Kevin that night. Chris Burnett would be given a light sentence in exchange for his cooperation, as he had been at the planning stage of the murder. Could Burnett forget Kevin Foster after betraying his good friend to the police? One thing became clear. Kevin Foster would not forget how Chris Burnett betrayed him to authorities. Sun shines in Florida, but not always on the speed of the legal system. With the trial approaching, parents and lawyers convinced Pete, Chris, and Derek to testify against Kevin in exchange to spare their lives. In March of 1998, Kevin Foster would be the sole member of the Lords of Chaos to stand trial. Lee County prosecutors Marshall Hall and Bob Lee offered Kevin Foster life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kevin rejected the offer and told one of his attorneys, Bob Jacobs, that he considered life without parole worse than being sent to Florida's electric chair, Old Sparky. Jury selection for the leader of the Lords of Chaos began on March 3, 1998, and would be presided over by Judge Isaac Anderson. Kevin's mother testified that Kevin was with her the night Mark Schwebes was murdered. However, the other members of the Lords of Chaos would testify that Kevin not only was there, but that he orchestrated the crime and was the trigger man. Dave Atkins, Mark's friend, would testify that he saw Mark's car parked at the spot where Mark confronted the group. Kevin sat stone-faced throughout much of the trial, perhaps a testimony to how morally corrupt Kevin Foster was deep inside. On March 11th, the jury would hear closing arguments in the case and retire to deliberate the fate of Kevin Foster, or as he liked to be called, God. After deliberation of 2 hours and 16 minutes, Kevin Foster, aka God, was found guilty of Mark Schwebes' murder. On April 9th, the penalty phase of the trial would begin. The task was straightforward. Should Kevin Foster receive life in prison without parole or face the death penalty? Kevin Foster was sentenced to death in a jury vote of 9-3, which Judge Anderson affirmed. To this date, Kevin Foster is on Florida's death row at Union Correctional Facility. Pete McNaughty was sentenced to 32 years in prison, which ironically is the age of Mark Schwebes at the time of his death. Pete McNaughty is not scheduled to be released until November 22, 2023, and is housed at Cross City East Unit. Chris Black and Derek Shields are serving a life sentence in the Florida correctional system and are currently incarcerated. Burnett was sentenced to 2 years in county jail for non-homicidal offenses. Another associate of the Lords of Chaos was sentenced to 1 year in county jail, 10 years probation, 100 hours of community service, and restitution. Derek Shields, the one who lured Mark Schwebes to his doom, would come to regret his actions, saying, quote, "I feel guilty about it. I should have done something to stop it." Another chapter was soon to be written by Kevin Foster and his mother Ruby. The trial of the Lords of Chaos was over, and Fort Myers was healing. Kevin Foster would not, or could not, forget those who testified and betrayed him. Jim Greenhill, a journalist, would have conversations with Kevin's mother, and would soon be corresponding with Kevin Foster himself. Kevin and Jim would exchange letters. Kevin, in the letters, proclaimed that he was not the murderer. The subject of the letters included everything from driving a truck, religion, and morals. In March of 1999, Kevin invited Jim to death row to pay him a visit. With the help of Kevin's mother, Ruby, Jim was ready to meet the leader of the Lords of Chaos. Police warned Jim not to be pulled in by Kevin or Ruby, who they believe had an ulterior motive for meeting with Jim. Jim would describe Kevin's eyes as lost, and not the cold eyes he had remembered from the trial. Jim, on a regular basis, would make the 5-hour drive to death row with Kevin's mother. Kevin and Ruby would pull Jim into their web with compliments, assurances of innocence, and friendship. Kevin and Ruby wanted to use Jim for revenge, but Jim still had no idea of the plot brewing around him. From the amply named Stark, Florida, sat death row, and it is from here Kevin put his plan into motion for revenge. Kevin's anger towards Burnett, who cut a deal with prosecutors, was growing, and Jim could sense it. Kevin expressed remorse to Jim for not confronting authority figures when he had the chance, and of girls he wanted to kiss. Kevin even told Jim that one summer he had taken care of an ill cancer patient. Jim shared with Kevin the reason behind his terrible battle with alcohol. Jim shared with Kevin that one evening he had gotten drunk and fired an AK-47 in the air while standing in the middle of a road. Jim, inspired by Kevin, would purchase a gun. Jim had not owned a gun in several years. In fact, he had not owned a firearm since college. Jim liked how it felt in his hands. Kevin encouraged Jim's newfound hobby, and even asked his mother to give Jim his favorite gun. Jim confessed to Kevin a dark dream he had. Kevin, always wanting to capitalize, asked Jim what if he could get away with murder. Jim told Kevin that the thought would excite him, sexually. Kevin would soon launch his final plan. How could Kevin strike back at those he perceived had betrayed him? How could Kevin exact his revenge on Chris Burnett, who first betrayed him, and others who eventually spoke out against him? After all, Kevin was on death row. Kevin was filing appeals, but had one problem: witnesses. He could not hope for a successful appeal with witnesses who had and would testify against him again. Even if the ones locked away could not testify, Kevin had more witnesses, who were free, who personally heard him confess. Chris Burnett was one of them. On June 11th, 2000, Kevin laid out a plan to Jim to rid those who had betrayed him. "Tell them you're an author," Kevin instructed Jim. "Tell them that you'll pay them to meet and hang out for the day. Stack them in hourly intervals and meet them in an empty parking lot. Zap them with a stun gun and take them to an empty grave and shoot them." Kevin's mind for revenge knew no limits. Kevin's last words to Chris Burnett were, "See you in hell." Now Kevin wanted to make good on that promise. Kevin's mother reached out to Jim and informed him that she was in on the plan to kill those Kevin had instructed. Ruby gave Jim a Remington Model 31 16-gauge shotgun. Jim informed Ruby he would take care of Chris Burnett first, as he figured Burnett would be trouble. Ruby insisted, unlike Kevin's case, that these murders be unsolvable, and to rid the crime scene of forensic evidence like shells. Additionally, Ruby instructed Jim to get a bag of lye, so animals would not come and disturb the graves. As the summer of 2000 was ending, Jim drove to death row one last time. In 17 months, Jim had visited death row 25 times and spent 150 hours with Kevin. Kevin's hit list extended beyond the three who had betrayed him. It included the judge, his defense lawyer, and even the sheriff. In the end, Jim realized that the plans were no longer fantasy, but real life. Like Derek, Pete, and Chris, he had a decision to make. Jim picked up the phone and called the original prosecutor and informed him of the entire plan. So Jim Greenhill, the prospective hitman, would turn state evidence and cooperate. In a truck outside a local Walmart, Jim met Ruby, and he was wearing a wire. Ruby did not think Jim would betray Kevin. She trusted Jim because Kevin trusted Jim. Jim Greenhill was about to hand over Kevin Foster, much in the way Chris Burnett had handed over his one-time friend. Jim would later say he never felt guilty for betraying Kevin. Quote, "Kevin made his choices. The chips fell where they may." End quote. Ruby Foster was arrested near her workplace. The day the murder plot made news, Kevin was moved to an even tighter confinement. Kevin eventually found out he was facing the same charges as his mother: conspiracy to commit murder. Ruby Foster was eventually sentenced to 5 years for her role in the murder plot. Jim would like to be there for Kevin's execution, not for some spectacle or revenge, but as a friend. Beyond the Blood explored the motive. Kevin Foster was a leader of sick proportions who was motivated by blood. Indeed, he felt powerful off of chaos. Power was a drug to Kevin Foster, and this power he could hold over Derek, Pete, and Chris, who wanted a taste of power. Having been belittled by classmates, Derek, Pete, and Chris could be easily influenced. Lords of Chaos is a tale of power and weakness coming to a head. Years before Columbine and the Trenchcoat Mafia, the Lords of Chaos were the original group of teenage terror. For more information on this case, Jim Greenhill has published a book entitled Someone Has to Die Tonight. I want to thank you for listening to Beyond the Blood. This is the first of my bi-weekly podcasts. I am Earthen Brown. I created Beyond the Blood because, as a police officer myself, I wanted to give listeners an insight into little or forgotten crimes and lay out the possible motive throughout and at the end of each tale. This podcast isn't about me. Beyond the Blood is available on iTunes, Podbean, and Stitcher Radio.